So pictured here on this page are the two textbooks I was talking about in the previous section. The Texas textbook, the famously infamous one that refers to African slaves brought over here to the Americas as African workers, and Colton, Palmer, and Kramer's A History of the Modern World. Now, both are actually produced by McGraw-Hill, which is a textbook company, with a fairly substantial publishing firm, although not quite the monopoly that Pearson is going to be after Common Core is implemented, but still. And what's interesting here is that a good textbook and a good history book are not always the same thing. So, as I explained before, in terms of being a good textbook, by a lot of the rules in the Salin text, the book, the Texas textbook, actually performs really well. It uses its fonts effectively. It's very easy to read. It explains its illustration. It has the illustration down here of the map, a full explanation of what it is. All the colors are used effectively, and there are blurbs explaining them. The colors draw you in. It's easy to follow. It's giving them enough information, or in this case, misinformation, and it's very digestible. This is something that you could show to a student easily who had maybe issues paying more like attention issues, and they could read it very easily without getting lost or getting confused, which speaks very well for this textbook. Of course, it is horribly inaccurate. Now, the Colton, Palmer, and Kramer textbook is the exact opposite case. It's a really good history textbook. In fact, it's the one I learned AP era out of. And if you're looking for facts about anything from the Reformation to the French Revolution, it's incredibly accurate. There's no ill portrayals, there's no stereotypes, the information is good. It's a great history book. But as a textbook, one aimed at all learners, not just at history learners, it is lacking. The information tends to be in very large paragraph sections. There isn't a whole lot of subheadings where there could be. There'll be major chapter headings, and there were major subheadings for different sections, but each of those sections could be well over a page long and weren't always as easily broken up inside of them was. And that's that's a problem, because again, for a student with an attention issue or a student who just simply has trouble following a historical narrative, it's going to be much harder for them to comprehend the average page in A History of the Modern World than in the Texas United States history textbook. That now represents a problem for the teacher. If you are an educator who is in a situation where you do get some say over your textbooks, you now are presented with a dilemma. What should you weigh more heavily? The content of the book, is it a good history textbook? Or the actual quality of it as a textbook? Is it effective in presenting its information, even if that information is of inferior quality? How do you balance these out? What is the responsible way to how do you make sure that you respect your students as scholars enough to make sure they have the accurate information while still respecting them as learners and their learning style by not overwhelming them with a book that may be very difficult for them to understand? Now, I do understand I am comparing a standard high school textbook with an AP textbook that's designed more for college students, but I think the comparison is still valid. So now the other area of content, which was the most important area that Salin focused on, was content, and so content differentiation, the planning pyramid. So even though Salin didn't talk about it, it was talked about exclusively in the Reading Teacher, which is an academic journal, and it's one of the readings we had for class. And one thing that's very interesting about it is the planning pyramid seeks to basically try and kind of come to grips with the fact that not all your students are going to learn everything. So the idea is that you actually differentiate the content. Now, that's not to say that you group the class or track the class into high achievers, mid achievers, and low achievers. It's not what we're doing here. Instead, the idea is that you basically break the lesson up and think about it in these 3 terms. The base of the pyramid is what all students must grasp. That's what the takeaway has to be. So if you're doing a lecture on, say, the Crusades, and you got to say, well, what's the things I want them to grasp, number one, about the Crusades? So things like it wasn't just a Christian versus Muslim contest. The Crusades were more often than not failures. They strengthened the church and its hold on politics back in Europe. Things like that. Let's say those are your 3 major points, that if your students learn nothing else about the Crusades, they need to understand those. Then you have what most students should grasp. So essentially, what you're saying is the bottom is a priority. Everyone, from the student who's going to one day write history books to the student that really does not function well in a classroom setting at all of them must grasp those 3, if you can help it. The middle category is what most students should get. So additional points on those might be explaining things like how the military trouble between the Turks and the Byzantines affected the course of the First Crusade. Things like how the tensions begun by the Peasants' Crusade affected eventually the outcome of the Fourth Crusade, where they just outright attacked Constantinople and completely neglected to go anywhere near the Holy Land. Additional things might be how the Peace of God movement was tied into the Crusades, or how religious bigotries at home in Europe, especially against the Jews, were exacerbated by the Crusades. And so that's what most students should grasp. So you're acknowledging in this that not everyone is going to get to this content. Not everyone's going to get it. But these students should. But most of them should. And then finally, the top pyramid is what only some students may grasp. So these are a little bit maybe above grade level. These are the really deep concepts. This is for the students that are really into the lesson. They're going to get this stuff. Maybe. The rest of them aren't. So that might be stuff for the Crusades, for example, like how the policies of medieval feuding affected the rhetoric in papal speeches, how the Albigensian Crusade affected the rise of the French monarchy, and things like that, or how the Reconquista is framed in a crusade type of narrative. These are things that are well beyond what, say, the average high school student would ever need to understand about the Crusades, but it's still there for the student that really wants it. Now, the trick is this is kind of twofold, because in one breath, you might present a lesson, and part of it is realizing that you have to devote the most time and the most resources to the bottom, then the middle, then the top. So as fun as it might be to go off on European feudalism, and yes, it is fun, you can't do that if your students are still having trouble grasping that it's not a Christian versus Muslim contest, that you still had Christians fighting Christians and Muslims fighting Muslims throughout this thing. And so if they're not grasping that, you need to devote more time to those central topics, even if that may mean taking time away from stuff in the middle and stuff at the top of the pyramid. And so that's one where you can differentiate your content by essentially not making a requirement that all students learn all of these things, or not treating all of these things as equal. You have the most basic concepts, and those are sort of the most required, then the median, and then the sort of above, the exemplary. So, one area the Salem text didn't talk about was practice, historical practice in a social studies classroom. And I think that's a bit of an oversight, because there's actually quite a bit of literature on this, both in historical journals and educational journals. So one area in which it has to do with historical theory. And the first question is, should we be showing a diversity of theories or just one theory? So historical theories include Begriffsgeschichte, or conceptual history, the history of concepts, Marxism, Marxist conflict theory, the synthesis and the the thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis, all of that. Deep history, cyclical history, great man's history, evolutionary history, progress, things like that. These are all historical theories. Should we just be showing one? Should we just talk about history as progress, or history as conflict, or history as cycles? Or should we allow all of those points? Should we try and take, say, a historical event like the French Revolution? It's a great example. Take the French Revolution. You could explain a lot of ways. You could explain it in a Berggrafische way, explaining how the concept of the three estates changed from the Middle Ages to the time of the French Revolution to afterwards. How terms like bourgeoisie and monarchist, liberal, conservative, how many of these terms took on meaning during this period, or their meaning changed. To say one was bourgeoisie or burger class in the Middle Ages meant you were closer to middle class or even low on the totem pole. Afterwards, it means you're at the top of the totem pole. It's very interesting. And I know that's a culturally inappropriate reference, but bear with me. And then the other is the application of historical theories to disability studies. Should we talk about the conceptual history, the Begriffsgeschichte of disabilities, how disabilities were first conceived of as, in ancient times, it was sign of the wrath of the gods on an individual. And then in the evolutionary periods, like with social Darwinism, there was a lot of look at them as unfavorable traits that should be phased out of the gene pool, to a current perspective of diversity, of like cognitive diversity, and the idea of the disabled not being actually so much disabled, but being still able to live and accomplish a more normative, fulfilling life. Should we talk about Marxism in any of this, or deep history, exploring about deep history about what makes us human and looking at a more psychological, more full human approach to history, and how should that be applied to disability studies? Perhaps it might help to shine light on things or expressions of behavior or ways of looking at behavior that, especially where you have cognitive diversity, someone with a OCD perspective might be able to yield some very interesting light on certain cultural practices of organization and things like that, as maybe being more fundamental than the average historian might take them to be. And that could yield some very interesting deep history sort of perspectives. Then there's the use of hands-on learning, practice in the classroom. And so one issue is, how do you do hands-on learning? Because, of course, if we had time machines, this would be easy. But regrettably, we do not. And so, as a result, is how do you make a hands-on kinesthetic sort of history? It's not like a science classroom. That's one thing that I found rather difficult. Is for science, this is kind of easy. The science teacher gets easy. You can do all sorts of experiments in a class. You can, blow up beakers and do, use salt water to connect an electrical circuit and cool stuff like that. But you can't. It's a little harder to do this with history. So using museums was one suggestion that the Journal of History teacher mentioned. Historical sites was another. One that I've always been curious about are things like reenactments, like mock battles and things like that, as a method to maybe make the history come alive. Let the students experience what it might have been like to stand in a Greek phalanx or something like that. Of course, these have limits. You have students with mobility issues. I will say I have seen at least one mock battle where an individual with a power chair was actually incorporated into the mock battle, and she did a fairly effective job as part of the phalanx, from my remembrance of it. So anyway, the other issue is differentiating assessment. And I brought these two pictures to show the two different approaches to assessment. On one side is an old 19th century image called the Arab jeweler, and this is sort of similar to the it's a very handcrafted type of process. He's taking his time. And this is sort of the way that UDL and differentiated instruction would like assessment to go. That the teacher go in and be able to give different assessments to different students based upon their needs and based upon their abilities and their lack of abilities. But unfortunately, there is an issue with this. And one of the issues is that is going to be Common Core.